It wasn't the pounding that made the nurse at the station look up that night. Pounding is common in hospital wards, patients needing help, visitors wanting in. No, it was the glass. The wet, rhythmic crack, crack, crack of knuckles splitting against reinforced window pane, each hit louder than the last, like something trying to claw its way into a tomb. That was the sound of Lucia's sanctuary shattering. She was just a waitress, recovering from the beating her father gave her. He was the most untouchable man in the underworld, a man who would set the city ablaze for a debt unpaid. When her father came back to finish what he started, she didn't call security. She called the monster. And the monster, he was already on his way. Just before we start, comment where you are watching from. The morphine had worn off sometime during the night, leaving Lucia alone with the pain. It arrived in layers. First, the dull, grinding throb in her left arm where the bone had snapped. Then the sharper ache radiating from her skull where his ring had split the skin above her eyebrow. She kept her eyes closed, counting the beeps of the heart monitor beside her bed, trying to convince herself that the rhythm meant safety. Hospitals were supposed to be sanctuaries. White walls, locked doors, security guards who asked for ID. She shifted against the thin pillow, and the movement sent lightning up her casted arm. A whimper escaped before she could swallow it back. Pathetic. Even here, alone, she was still afraid of making noise, of drawing attention, of being heard. The silence struck her then. Lucia's eyes opened to the dim glow of the bedside lamp. The only light in the room, besides the pale wash from the parking lot outside. The ward should have been humming with life. The squeak of nurses' shoes on linoleum, the murmur of late-night television from neighboring rooms, the rattle of medication carts. Instead, there was nothing. Just the beep of her monitor and the faint hiss of the heating vent overhead. She turned her head slowly, careful not to trigger another spike of pain. The nurse's station at the end of the hall sat empty, the computer screen casting a blue glow across abandoned clipboards and a half-empty coffee cup. Where were they? It had to be past midnight. But even on night shifts, someone was always there, always watching. The breath fogged the window before she saw him. Condensation bloomed against the glass in rhythmic clouds, each one larger than the last. Lucia's heart seized. The ground floor room had seemed like a blessing when they'd wheeled her in. Easy access for the doctors, a view of the small courtyard garden instead of the depressing parking garage. Now, staring at that wet fog spreading across the pane, she understood what ground floor really meant. It meant he could reach her. The figure materialized out of the rain-soaked darkness, like something dredged from a nightmare. Alessandro Lombardi pressed his face against the glass, his features distorted by water and the mottled texture of the reinforced window. But she knew him. She would know that face in any light, in any condition. The face that had smiled at her 5th birthday party, the face that had backhanded her across the kitchen 3 nights ago when she'd told him no. She didn't have any more tip money to give him. His mouth moved, forming words she couldn't hear, but could read in the shape of his lips. "Open the door. Let me in, you ungrateful little..." Lucia's working hand clutched the blanket, dragging it up to her chin as if cotton could protect her from him. Her thumb fumbled for the call button, clipped to the bed rail, pressing it once, twice, 3 times. No one came. The hallway remained dark and empty. Alessandro's palm slapped against the glass. Once. The sound was muffled but distinct, like meat hitting a cutting board. He pulled back and did it again, harder this time. The window shuddered in its frame. His eyes, bloodshot, wild, desperate, locked onto hers. She saw the familiar cocktail of rage and panic that meant he was in deep, deeper than usual. the kind of deep that made men do irreversible things. He wasn't just here to threaten her, he was here to collect. The pounding intensified, both fists now hammering against the reinforced glass with the rhythmic determination of someone who had nothing left to lose. Lucia's monitor began to shriek as her heart rate spiked, the beeps accelerating into a single sustained alarm. Still, no one came running. The ward remained a tomb. She watched a thin crack spider from the corner of the window where his signet ring, the one her grandmother gave him, the one he'd never pawned no matter how desperate, struck the same spot over and over. The glass was reinforced, designed to withstand impact, but Alessandro had always been persistent. It was the only quality he'd never lost, even as everything else, his job, his dignity, his family, had crumbled to dust. Lucia's breath came in short, sharp gasps. The pain in her arm was nothing compared to the ice flooding her veins. She was trapped, a bird in a glass cage, watching the cat circle closer. The police wouldn't come in time. The nurses were gone. The door to her room stood open to an empty hallway that suddenly felt miles long. Her right hand slid beneath the pillow, fingers brushing the edge of cold metal. The burner phone, the one the quiet man in the expensive suit had pressed into her palm 2 weeks ago at the diner, after she'd served him his usual espresso and told him she hoped he had a good night, after she'd treated him like he was human. "If you ever need a way out," he'd said, "call this number. Only this number." Outside, Alessandro found something heavy. Through the rain-streaked glass, Lucia saw him lift what looked like a brick from the courtyard's decorative border. He hefted it in both hands, his mouth twisted into something that might have been a smile or a snarl. She pulled out the black phone. Her thumb shook as she pressed the only number saved in its memory. 1 ring. The brick came down on the glass. The crack widened, splitting into a web. 2 rings. Alessandro wound up again, screaming something she still couldn't hear. 3 rings, then a voice, smooth and dark as midnight. "Where are you?" The glass exploded inward as Lucia whispered the address. The crack spread like lightning, frozen in glass, branching out from the impact point in jagged fingers that reached toward the edges of the window frame. Lucia couldn't breathe. Her ribs felt compressed, as if the air itself had turned solid in her lungs. The heart monitor screamed its electronic panic, but the sound felt distant, muffled, like she was drowning and the machine was calling from the surface. Alessandro's face appeared in the gap where the brick had punched through, bits of safety glass clinging to his hair like rain-wet diamonds. His eyes found hers and she saw it, the thing she'd spent 23 years pretending wasn't there. He didn't see her as his daughter. He never had. She was currency, a thing to be spent. "Lucia." His voice carried through the broken window, hoarse and wrong. "Baby, open the door. We can fix this. I just need you to come with me for a few hours. That's all. Just a few hours and everything goes back to normal." Normal. The word tasted like blood in her mouth. Normal was him coming home smelling like cheap whiskey and cheaper desperation. Normal was checking the locks 3 times before bed. Normal was the cicada shell version of herself she'd become, hollowed out and brittle, waiting for the next crack. Her hand closed around the burner phone beneath the pillow, and the cool metal against her palm was the only real thing left in the world. She dragged it out, her casted arm useless and heavy across her stomach. The phone was simple, ancient by modern standards. No touch screen, just a numbered keypad and a tiny grayscale display. 1 contact, 1 lifeline. She'd thought about throwing it away a dozen times. What kind of woman keeps a direct line to a man like Massimo Palermo? What kind of desperation did that signal? But she'd kept it, tucked it in her apron pocket during shifts, slid it under her pillow at night. Some part of her had known. Some animal instinct had recognized that men like her father didn't stop. They escalated. Alessandro disappeared from the window. For 3 heartbeats, there was nothing but the sound of rain and her own ragged breathing. Then she heard it, the scrape of metal on concrete. He was looking for something bigger. Lucia's thumb found the call button. The phone didn't ring in the traditional sense. It simply connected, a soft click followed by silence. She pressed it to her ear with a shaking hand. "Where are you?" The voice that answered was dark velvet over steel. No greeting, no hesitation. Just the question that mattered, delivered with the certainty of a man who had been waiting for this call, who had perhaps known it would come. "St. Catherine's Hospital." Her voice came out broken, barely a whisper. "Ground floor, East Wing, room 104, he's—" The window exploded. Lucia screamed, rolling off the far side of the bed as glass rained down across the sheets where she'd been lying seconds before. The IV stand clattered to the floor, the line ripping free from her arm in a bloom of bright pain. She hit the linoleum hard, her casted arm taking the impact, and the world went white for a moment. When her vision cleared, she saw Alessandro climbing through the shattered window frame, his hands bleeding where the glass had torn his palms. He didn't seem to notice. "Still there?" Massimo's voice, still calm, still controlled. She could hear movement on his end, doors opening, voices shouting in rapid Italian. "Yes." She crawled backward, dragging herself toward the bathroom with her good arm. The phone stayed pressed to her ear, slick with sweat. "Please, please, He's—" Alessandro's boots crunched on broken glass as he stepped into the room. He'd found a crowbar, black and heavy, the kind used to pry open shipping crates. It hung loose in his right hand, casual, like he was just holding a walking stick. Like this was normal. "Lucia, baby, hang up the phone." His voice had gone soft, the way it used to when she was small and he'd tuck her in at night before the gambling got bad, before her mother left, before everything turned to ash. "Whoever that is, they can't help you. Nobody can help you but me. You understand? I'm your father. I'm your blood. How long?" Massimo's voice cut through her terror like a blade. She looked at Alessandro, at the crowbar, at the way he was moving toward her with the slow, patient stalking of a hunter who knew his prey was cornered. The bathroom was too far. The hallway was empty. There was nowhere left to run. "Not long," she whispered. Alessandro raised the crowbar. The metal caught the lamplight, gleaming, dull and final. His face had gone blank, empty of everything except necessity. This was the face of a man who'd already made his choice, who'd already decided what she was worth. "Don't move," Massimo said, and the line went dead. Alessandro swung. The crowbar whistled through the air, and Lucia's world narrowed to that arc of metal descending toward her skull. She threw her good arm up in a useless, instinctive gesture, knowing it wouldn't be enough, knowing this was how it ended, on a hospital floor, killed by the man who was supposed to protect her. Then the room turned to daylight. Headlights blazed through the shattered window with the intensity of a stage spotlight. Freezing Alessandro mid-swing. He staggered, throwing up a hand to shield his eyes, the crowbar wavering. Lucia heard it then, the roar of engines, multiple vehicles moving fast across terrain they weren't meant to cross. Tires churned up wet grass and decorative gravel. Something metal scraped concrete with a sound like a blade being sharpened. "What the—" Alessandro spun toward the window, and whatever he saw there drained the color from his face. 3 black SUVs had mounted the curb and torn across the hospital's carefully maintained courtyard, their headlights forming a wall of light that turned the rain into silver needles. They weren't parked. They were positioned, angled to create a perimeter with the precision of a military operation. Before the engines even cut off, the doors opened. Men emerged into the rain. 6 of them. Maybe more. Lucia couldn't count, couldn't process what she was seeing through the shock and the pain and the impossible relief flooding her system. They moved like water, fluid and synchronized, each one dressed in dark clothes that made them nearly invisible outside the headlights' glare. She caught the matte black gleam of weapons, held low and ready. Alessandro backed away from the window, the crowbar dropping to hang loose at his side. No, this isn't. I just need to talk to my daughter. This is family business. Drop the weapon. The command came from outside, amplified and emotionless. Hands where we can see them. Now. For a moment, Lucia thought he might actually fight. Alessandro's grip tightened on the crowbar, his body tensing with the same reckless desperation that had driven him through the window in the first place. Then one of the dark figures outside shifted, and a red laser dot appeared on Alessandro's chest, steady as a heartbeat. If you are enjoying this story, hit that subscribe and like button. The crowbar hit the floor with a clang that made Lucia flinch. Smart choice, the voice said. Then, softer, get him out of here. 2 of the men came through the window with an efficiency that suggested they'd done this 1,000 times before. They had Alessandro in zip ties and hauled back outside before Lucia could even process that she was safe, that the crowbar was no longer a threat, that she could breathe again. The door to her room opened. Massimo Palermo stepped into the chaos like he was entering a boardroom, not a crime scene. He wore a black overcoat that probably cost more than Lucia made in 6 months. And somehow, impossibly, there wasn't a drop of rain on him. Someone must have held an umbrella during the 30 feet from the SUV to the door. His dark hair was swept back from a face that belonged in Renaissance paintings, all sharp angles and aristocratic bones, and his eyes were the color of espresso pulled too long. Those eyes found her immediately, cataloguing her position on the floor, the blood on her hospital gown where the IV had torn free, the way she was cradling her casted arm against her chest. Something flickered across his expression, there and gone so fast she might have imagined it. He crossed to her in 3 strides, glass crunching under his leather shoes. Up close, she could see the details she'd always tried not to notice during his visits to the diner. The faint scar above his left eyebrow, the silver cufflinks at his wrists, the way he moved with the absolute confidence of a man who had never been told no in his life. "Can you stand?" His voice was quieter than it had been on the phone, almost gentle. Lucia nodded, not trusting her voice. Massimo extended a hand, and after a moment's hesitation, she took it. His palm was warm and calloused in ways that surprised her. These weren't the soft hands of someone who just gave orders. He pulled her to her feet with an ease that made her feel weightless, steadying her when she swayed. He shrugged out of his overcoat and draped it around her shoulders in one smooth motion. The silk lining was still warm from his body, and it smelled like expensive cologne and gun oil. The coat swallowed her, falling past her knees, and Massimo fastened the top button with a focus that suggested this was the most important task he'd perform all night. "You're safe now," he said, and the certainty in his voice made her believe it. A commotion outside drew his attention. Through the broken window, Lucia could see Alessandro being dragged toward one of the SUVs, his face a mask of terror as he struggled against his captors. He was screaming something, his voice high and desperate, but the words were lost in the rain. Massimo's expression went cold. He walked to the window and looked out at Alessandro with the dispassionate interest of an entomologist examining an insect. When he spoke, his voice carried the weight of an execution order. "He's a dead man walking." The SUV's interior smelled like leather and something darker, cordite maybe, or just the residue of violence that clung to everything in Massimo's world. Lucia sat in the back seat, drowning in his overcoat, watching the city blur past through tinted windows that turned the streetlights into golden smears. One of Massimo's men had bandaged her arm where the IV had torn free, his hands surprisingly gentle for someone carrying 3 visible weapons. Massimo sat beside her, close enough that his shoulder brushed hers whenever the vehicle turned. He hadn't spoken since they'd left the hospital, just made a brief phone call in rapid Italian that Lucia couldn't follow. But she felt his attention on her, like heat, checking and rechecking that she was still breathing, still whole. "Where are we going?" Her voice came out smaller than she'd intended. "Somewhere he can't reach you." Massimo's eyes stayed fixed on the window, watching the city with the vigilance of a man who trusted nothing. Somewhere no one can. The somewhere turned out to be a fortress disguised as a home. The mansion materialized out of the darkness like a monument to controlled paranoia, all brutal concrete angles and walls that rose 12 feet high, topped with wrought iron that was definitely decorative and possibly electrified. Security cameras tracked their approach from multiple angles. The gates opened without anyone pressing a button, some invisible hand granting them passage, and closed behind them with a finality that sounded like a bank vault ceiling. The main house was modernist brutalism, softened by ivy and strategic lighting. But Lucia could see the bones of what it really was, a bunker built by someone who understood that wealth made you a target. Every window was narrow and positioned high. Every approach was covered by sightlines that would give defenders the advantage. It was beautiful the way a military installation was beautiful, functional, imposing, absolutely secure. Inside, the contrast was immediate and disorienting. Marble floors caught the light from chandeliers that probably cost more than her entire apartment building. Original artwork, pieces she recognized from community college art history classes, hung on walls the color of old money. A sweeping staircase curved upward toward a second floor that seemed to go on forever. Lucia had grown up in a 2-bedroom apartment where the heat only worked half the winter. She'd eaten dinners made from whatever was on sale and learned to make a dollar stretch until it screamed. This wasn't just wealth. This was generational, dynastic, the kind of money that bent reality to its will. A woman in a crisp white coat waited in what Massimo called the East sitting room, though it was larger than Lucia's entire apartment. The doctor, Dr. Rossi, she introduced herself, had kind eyes behind wire-rimmed glasses and hands that moved with practiced efficiency as she examined Lucia's injuries under the warm glow of a Tiffany lamp. "The cast is holding well," Dr. Rossi said, probing gently at the edges. "No additional damage from the fall. You were lucky." She cleaned and rebandaged the IV site, then turned her attention to the head wound. "This will need fresh stitches. The ones from the hospital pulled loose. It's going to hurt." "It already hurts," Lucia said, and Dr. Rossi smiled. "Then let's not make it worse than necessary." Throughout the examination, Massimo stood by the window, his back to them, but his posture radiating attention. He was listening to every word, tracking every wince and sharp intake of breath. When Dr. Rossi administered a local anesthetic and began working on the stitches, his shoulders tensed as if he could feel each pull of the needle through Lucia's skin. "She needs rest," Dr. Rossi said when she'd finished, snapping off her gloves. Real rest, not hospital rest. I've left medication for the pain, but she shouldn't need the stronger opioids if she stays still for the next few days. The concussion was mild, but I want to monitor for any changes. I'll be back tomorrow morning. Massimo nodded, finally turning from the window. Thank you, Maria. The doctor's use of his first name, the familiarity between them, told Lucia this wasn't the first time Dr. Rossi had been called to this house to patch up wounds that couldn't see the inside of a hospital. She gathered her bag and left with a quiet efficiency that suggested she knew the way out. A woman who Lucia assumed was staff, though she moved with the same controlled awareness as Massimo's men, led her upstairs to a bedroom that made her want to laugh at the absurdity of it all. The bed was a 4-poster monstrosity, with linens that probably had a thread count higher than her credit score. French doors opened onto a balcony overlooking gardens she couldn't quite see in the darkness. The attached bathroom had heated marble floors and a shower that could fit 6 people. Lucia stood in the middle of all that luxury in a hospital gown and a borrowed coat, feeling like a stray cat someone had brought in from the rain. The staff prepared some clothes for you. Massimo's voice came from the doorway. He'd followed her up but hadn't entered, maintaining a careful distance. They should fit. If they don't, tell me. She nodded, too overwhelmed to speak. He should have left then. Should have returned to whatever empire-building or war-planning men like him did at this hour. Instead, Massimo stepped into the room and settled into the chair by the window, the same way he'd sat in countless booths at the diner, watching her move between tables. Sleep, he said quietly. I'll be here. You don't have to, I know. His eyes met hers in the low light, and there was something in them she couldn't name. Something that had been there every Tuesday and Friday for 6 months when he'd ordered his espresso and left tips that were larger than her rent. Sleep, Lucia. So she did, crawling into sheets that felt like clouds, knowing that the most dangerous man in the city was standing guard, and somehow, impossibly, she felt safe. Lucia woke to voices filtering through the floor. Male voices, multiple of them, speaking in the clipped cadence of men delivering bad news. She blinked at the ceiling, disoriented by the unfamiliar crown molding and the quality of light coming through curtains she didn't recognize. Then the previous night rushed back, the hospital, the window. Alessandro's face contorted with desperation. Massimo's coat around her shoulders. She sat up carefully, testing her body's limits. The pain had dulled to a manageable ache. Probably thanks to whatever Dr. Rossi had left her. Someone had placed water and pills on the nightstand while she slept, along with a note in elegant script. Take these. MM. The clothes laid out on the chair were simple but expensive. Soft cotton pants and a cashmere sweater in deep grey. They fit perfectly, which should have been comforting, but instead sent a small shiver down her spine. How much did Massimo know about her? How long had he been paying attention? The voices grew clearer as she approached the door. Not shouting, but intense. The kind of conversation where men chose their words carefully because lives hung in the balance. She shouldn't go down there. Whatever was being discussed in the depths of this fortress wasn't meant for her ears. She went anyway. The hallway led to a gallery overlooking what must have been a study or library. Lucia stayed in the shadows at the top of the stairs, hidden behind an ornamental column, and looked down at the gathering below. 5 men sat around a table that looked like it had been carved from a single piece of black walnut. Massimo occupied the head, his posture relaxed but his eyes sharp. The others were older, harder, men who wore expensive suits over bodies that remembered violence. Capos, she realized, the officers of his organization. Say it again." Massimo's voice was soft, but it cut through the room like a blade. "Slowly." The man to his right, silver-haired, with a scar that ran from his temple to his jaw, cleared his throat. "Alessandro Lombardi owes the Scarpettas $97,000, gambling debts accumulated over 8 months. They've been patient, but Dominic Scarpetta called in the marker 2 weeks ago. And when Lombardi couldn't pay, he offered alternative compensation." The scarred man slid a piece of paper across the table. Even from her vantage point, Lucia could see it was a photograph of her. From the diner, smiling at some customer off camera, her apron slightly askew. His daughter. He told them she was compliant, willing to work off the debt as a hostess at their club. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. A hostess. Massimo spoke the word like it tasted of poison. Everyone at the table knew what hostess meant in the Scarpettas' establishments. The clubs where women disappeared into back rooms and emerged hollow-eyed, if they emerged at all. He promised them she was clean, young, and desperate enough not to run. The scarred man's voice carried disgust. They accepted. The contract was signed 3 days ago. They were supposed to collect her yesterday, but then she ended up in the hospital, and Lombardi panicked. He thought if he could deliver her himself, they might forgive the interest. Lucia's hand flew to her mouth, stifling the sound that wanted to escape. Her father hadn't just tried to hurt her. He'd sold her, bartered her body to clear his debts like she was a used car he no longer needed. Another man spoke up, younger, with the lean build of someone who did his own dirty work. "The Scarpettas know she's here, boss. They have eyes at the hospital. Security footage shows our extraction. They're calling it theft of property." "Property." Massimo's fingers drummed once against the table. A tell Lucia had learned meant he was 3 seconds from controlled violence. Lucia Lombardi is not property. She is not collateral. She is not a transaction. He stood, and every man at the table straightened instinctively. "She is under my protection. Explain this to me. How does Dominic Scarpetta think he can claim ownership of what's mine?" The silence that followed was absolute. The scarred man ventured carefully. "Boss, the Scarpettas will see this as an act of war. They have the contract. Legally speaking," Massimo interrupted, his voice dropping to a register that made the hair on Lucia's arms stand up. "I don't recognize contracts written in a woman's blood by her own father. Marco, what's our current relationship with the Scarpetta family?" "Neutral. We have territory agreements in place. Revenue sharing on the port operations. It's been peaceful for 3 years. And if I were to rescind those agreements," Marco chose his words carefully, "it would hurt them more than it hurts us. They need our shipping lanes. But it would be expensive for everyone involved." Massimo walked to the window, hands clasped behind his back. In the morning light, he looked like a general surveying a battlefield only he could see. "Issue a code black. I want every asset we have focused on Lucia's protection. Triple the perimeter security. No one enters this property without my personal authorization. Run background checks on every staff member, again. And I want eyes on every Scarpetta operation in the city." "Boss," Marco started. "I'm not finished." Massimo turned, and his expression was carved from ice. "Send word to Dominic. Tell him his contract with Alessandro Lombardi is void. Tell him if he or any of his men come within a city block of Lucia, I will burn his empire to the ground and salt the earth where it stood. Tell him I'm willing to go to war over this." "You're willing to risk everything," the scarred man said quietly. "For a waitress?" Massimo's smile was a terrible thing. "I'm willing to risk everything for what's mine. Make the calls." The men filed out, leaving Massimo alone in the study. Lucia watched him pour a drink from a crystal decanter, watched him stare into the amber liquid like it held answers to questions he hadn't asked yet. She should retreat, should go back to the bedroom and pretend she hadn't heard her life reduced to a commodity, her value measured in debt repayment. Instead, she descended the stairs. Massimo's hand froze halfway to his lips, the glass of whiskey catching the light. He didn't turn around, but his spine straightened in a way that told Lucia he'd known she was there. Had probably known the moment she'd started down the stairs. "You should be resting." His voice carried no accusation, just a statement of fact. "I heard everything." Lucia descended the last few steps, her bare feet silent on the cold marble. The cashmere sweater was soft against her skin, a luxury she still couldn't quite reconcile with the hospital gown she'd worn hours ago. "My father sold me, like livestock." "Your father," Massimo said, finally turning to face her, "is no longer a concern you need to carry." The past tense in that sentence settled between them like a third presence in the room. Lucia should have felt something: grief, horror, relief. Instead, there was just a hollow space where 23 years of daughterly obligation used to live. She moved deeper into the study, taking in details she'd missed from her hidden vantage point. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined 2 walls, filled with leather-bound volumes that looked red rather than decorative. A chess set sat frozen mid-game on a side table. The desk was clean, except for a single photograph in a silver frame. A young woman with dark hair and Massimo's eyes, smiling at the camera with the unself-conscious joy of someone who didn't know what was coming. "Your sister?" Lucia asked, nodding toward the photo. "Was." The single word carried the weight of a eulogy. 15 years ago. Lucia understood loss. She understood the way it carved you hollow and rearranged your architecture until you were something new and harder. She didn't offer empty condolences. Instead, she asked the question that had been burning in her chest since the hospital. "Why did you save me?" Massimo set down his glass, untouched. He regarded her with those dark eyes that missed nothing, and for a long moment she thought he wouldn't answer. Then he moved to the window, creating distance, and spoke to his own reflection in the glass. 6 months ago, I walked into that diner after a very bad day. The kind of day where you remember why people fear you, and you're not sure if you should be proud or ashamed of it. His voice was quiet, almost conversational. Every person in that restaurant knew who I was. The owner nearly dropped his tray. The other waitress refused to serve my table. They looked at me like I was a loaded gun on the counter. Lucia remembered that day. She'd been covering a double shift, exhausted and running on 3 hours of sleep. She'd seen the way the room had changed when Massimo entered. The sudden silence, the careful not looking that was more obvious than staring. "You brought me espresso," Massimo continued, "and you asked if I wanted anything else. Not because you were too naive to know who I was, but because you decided it didn't matter. You smiled, actually smiled, and told me you hoped I'd have a good evening. Like I was just another customer. Just a man who needed coffee." "You are just a man," Lucia said. He turned then, and the look on his face was something raw and unguarded. "No one has treated me like that in 15 years. Not since—" He gestured toward the photograph. "Everyone wants something. Power, protection, money. Or they're afraid and pretending not to be. But you just brought me coffee, and meant it when you said, 'Have a nice night.'" Lucia took a step closer, closing the distance he'd created. "So you've been watching me for 6 months, Because I was nice to you? I've been watching you, Massimo said, his voice dropping to something that might have been confession. Because in a world where everyone sees a monster, you saw a man who looked tired. And I couldn't stop wondering what kind of person still has that much kindness left after whatever put those shadows in your eyes. The air between them felt charged, heavy with things neither of them knew how to say. Lucia opened her mouth to respond, to tell him she wasn't kind. She was just too exhausted to be afraid anymore when the world exploded into sound. Alarms shrieked through the mansion with an intensity that made her clap her hands over her ears. Red emergency lights strobed in the hallway beyond the study. Somewhere deep in the house, she heard shouting, short, controlled bursts that sounded like combat commands. Massimo's entire demeanor shifted in a heartbeat. The vulnerable man disappeared, replaced by the general she'd seen earlier. He crossed to his desk in 3 strides, pulling open a drawer that revealed multiple handguns mounted in foam. He selected one, checked the magazine with practiced efficiency, and reached for his phone. "Talk to me," he said into it, his voice ice cold. Lucia couldn't hear the response, but she saw Massimo's jaw tighten. His eyes found hers across the study, and in them she saw calculation, fury, and something that might have been fear. How many? A pause. Where's the breach? Another pause, longer this time. Lock down everything. Move her to the safe room. Now! He ended the call and moved toward Lucia. She backed up instinctively, hitting the bookshelf. "What's happening?" "The Scarpettas didn't wait for my message." Massimo's hand closed around her wrist, gentle but immovable. "They brought an army, and your father is with them." The door to the study burst open. Marco appeared, weapon drawn, 2 more armed men flanking him. "Boss, East Perimeter is compromised. They came through the service gate with a truck bomb. We have maybe 3 minutes before they reach the main house." Massimo pulled Lucia toward the door, but she resisted, her mind racing. "You said this place was a fortress?" "It is." His eyes met hers, dark and certain, which means when they get through, it becomes a tomb. Move. The mansion that had felt like a sanctuary an hour ago transformed into a labyrinth of panic and precision. Staff members she hadn't even known existed appeared from doorways, some armed, some herding others toward what must have been reinforced rooms. The beautiful artwork, the expensive furniture, all of it became obstacles to navigate as Massimo hauled her through corridors she didn't recognize. An explosion rocked the foundation, close enough that dust rained from the ceiling. Lucia stumbled, and Massimo caught her, his arm an iron band around her waist. "They're inside!" Marco shouted from behind them. And in the distance, barely audible over the alarms and chaos, Lucia heard it, her father's voice, screaming her name like a curse. Gunfire shattered the night like breaking glass, sharp cracks that echoed through the mansion's stone corridors. Massimo dragged Lucia through a servant's passage she hadn't known existed, Marco and his men forming a protective wall at their backs. The beautiful fortress had transformed into a war zone in the span of heartbeats, and Lucia's mind struggled to process the impossible speed of the violence. "How many?" Massimo shouted over his shoulder, his grip on her wrist never loosening. "At least 20 on the east side," Marco called back, his weapon raised as they rounded a corner. "Maybe more coming through the gardens. They're organized, boss. This isn't street muscle. These are professionals." The Scarpettas had brought mercenaries. The realization settled like ice in Lucia's stomach. This wasn't a message or a show of force. This was an extraction mission. They'd come to take what they believed they'd bought. Another explosion, closer this time, sent tremors through the floor. Somewhere above them, she heard the distinct sound of breaking glass. Then more gunfire. Massimo's men were engaging on multiple floors, turning the mansion into a killing ground. They descended a narrow staircase that spiraled down into what must have been the mansion's oldest section. The air grew cooler, and the walls changed from plaster to bare stone. Massimo finally released her wrist to punch a code into a keypad hidden behind a loose brick. A section of wall slid open with the whisper of hydraulics, revealing a room that looked like it belonged in a military bunker. The panic room was 12 feet square, lined with monitors showing every angle of the property in high-definition black and white. Lucia could see the chaos unfolding in real time. Armed men in tactical gear moving through her father's old neighborhood with the efficiency of a SWAT team. Massimo's guards returning fire from fortified positions. And there, near the ruined East Gate, Alessandro cowering behind a vehicle while better-armed men did the fighting. Inside, Massimo's voice was commander-flat, stripped of the vulnerability he'd shown in the study. There's water, medical supplies, communications equipment. The walls are 18 inches of reinforced concrete. Nothing gets through them. Lucia looked at the room, then at him. At the gun in his hand, and the set of his shoulders that said he was going back out into that storm of bullets and fire. Something sharp and certain crystallized in her chest. No. Massimo's head snapped toward her, surprise flickering across his features. Lucia. I'm not hiding in a box while you die for me. She stepped away from the panic room's entrance, her casted arm held protectively against her chest, but her spine straight. They came here because of me. Because my father sold me like I was his property to liquidate. I won't let you. This isn't a negotiation. Massimo moved toward her, and she backed up another step. You think I pulled you out of that hospital to watch you get taken by the Scarpettas? You think I started a war just to lose you in it? Then don't lose. The words came out sharper than she'd intended, powered by a fury she hadn't known she possessed. But don't lock me away like I'm something fragile that needs to be stored in a vault. I'm not running anymore, Massimo. Not from my father. Not from them. Not from this. For a moment, something that might have been pride flickered in his eyes. Then the moment shattered as Marco's voice crackled through the radio on Massimo's belt. Boss, they're through the main entrance. We're falling back to the second defensive line, but... Shit, they've got heavy ordnance. We can't... The transmission dissolved into static and the sound of automatic weapons fire. Massimo's attention split between the radio and Lucia, calculation warring with something darker in his expression. Then he made his choice. He grabbed her hand and pulled her back toward the stairs, away from the panic room. Stay behind me. Do exactly what I say, when I say it. If I tell you to run, you run. Understood? She nodded, her heart hammering against her ribs. They emerged into chaos. The main floor of the mansion had transformed into a battlefield. Furniture overturned to create cover. Priceless artwork riddled with bullet holes. Two of Massimo's men crouched behind an overturned marble table, returning fire toward the main entrance, where shadows moved with tactical precision. The smell of cordite and something burning filled the air. Massimo pulled her toward the west wing, keeping low, his body constantly positioned between her and the fighting. They'd almost reached the corridor when one of the mercenaries appeared from a side room, his weapon already tracking toward them. Massimo fired twice. The man dropped, but the sound had drawn attention. More shadows peeled away from the main assault, converging on their position with the coordination of a pack hunt. Massimo shoved Lucia toward Marco, who'd appeared from somewhere with blood on his sleeve and murder in his eyes. Get her to the garage, Massimo ordered, already moving to intercept the incoming threats. Take the armored sedan. Go to the safe house in... The west wall exploded inward. The blast wave hit like a physical thing, lifting Lucia off her feet and sending her tumbling backward. Her ears rang with a high-pitched whine that drowned out everything else. She hit the floor hard, her casted arm taking the impact, and the world went white with pain. When her vision cleared, she was on the far side of a growing fire, separated from Massimo by flames and falling debris. She saw him through the smoke, saw him turn toward where she'd been standing, saw the exact moment he realized they'd been separated. "Lucia," his voice barely carried over the ringing in her ears. She tried to answer, but smoke filled her lungs. Men in tactical gear were pouring through the breach in the wall, too many of them, moving too fast. Marco was down, not moving. Massimo's remaining men formed up around their boss, but they were outnumbered 3-1. Then hands grabbed her from behind, rough and efficient. She tried to fight, but her body wouldn't cooperate, still stunned from the blast. She was lifted, carried toward the breach, and through the smoke and flames, she saw Massimo fighting like a man possessed, trying to reach her. But the distance between them grew with each second, filled with fire and enemies, and the inevitability of bad odds. The last thing she saw before they dragged her through the broken wall was Massimo's face, contorted with rage, and something that looked like despair, as he screamed her name into the burning night. The mercenaries dragged Lucia through smoke and rubble, their grips professional and impersonal. She kicked and twisted, but her body was still sluggish from the blast, her movements uncoordinated. They hauled her through what had been a garden and was now a crater, past the twisted remains of the east gate, toward vehicles idling in the street beyond. Then one of them grunted and dropped, a hole appearing in his tactical vest that bloomed red. The second man released her to return fire, and Lucia didn't wait. She ran. Not toward the vehicles or the street, but back toward the burning mansion. Back toward the chaos where Massimo was still fighting. Her lungs burned, her arms screamed protest, but she pushed through the smoke and found herself stumbling through a side entrance she didn't recognize into what must have been the service areas of the house. The kitchen. She'd somehow found the kitchen. All commercial-grade stainless steel and marble countertops, now thick with smoke that poured in from the main house. Emergency lighting cast everything in red, turning the space into something from a nightmare. Lucia pressed herself against the far counter, gasping for air, trying to orient herself. There had to be another exit, another way back to... "There you are." The voice came from the doorway, ragged and wrong. Alessandro emerged from the smoke like a ghost, his clothes torn and filthy. His face streaked with soot and something that might have been tears or sweat. He'd lost whatever weapon he'd been given, if he'd ever held one, and his hands shook as he reached toward her. "Baby, we have to go. Right now. They're losing. The Scarpettas are losing. And if we don't deliver you to them, they'll kill me. Do you understand? They'll kill me, and it'll be your fault." Lucia's back hit the counter behind her. The red emergency lights painted her father's face in shades of hell, all shadows and desperate angles. He looked smaller than she remembered, diminished by fear into something pathetic and dangerous in equal measure. "You sold me." Her voice came out steadier than she'd expected. "You tried to trade me to them like I was a car you didn't need anymore." "I didn't have a choice," Alessandro's voice cracked, rising toward hysteria. "You don't know what they do to people who don't pay. You don't know what they threatened. I'm your father, Lucia. I raised you. You owe me." He lunged, not with violence, but with the grabbing desperation of a drowning man. His hands caught her good arm, fingers digging in hard enough to bruise, and he tried to pull her toward the door, toward the Scarpettas, toward a life that would end with her hollow-eyed and used up in some back room. Something in Lucia snapped. 23 years of cowering, of making herself small, of absorbing his rage and his addiction and his endless, selfish need. All of it crystallized into a single, bright point of fury. Her free hand shot out, found the knife block on the counter behind her, and closed around a handle. She didn't think. She just moved. The blade came around in an arc that was instinct and desperation, catching Alessandro across the forearm. He screamed and released her, stumbling backward, staring at the blood welling through his torn sleeve with the shocked incomprehension of someone who'd never expected his victim to fight back. "You stabbed me." His voice was small, childlike. "Your own father. You stabbed me." Lucia held the knife between them, her hand steady despite the adrenaline making her heart hammer. The kitchen knife was 8 inches of carbon steel, designed for butchering meat, and the weight of it in her palm felt like justice. "I'm not going with you." Each word came out clear and final. "I'm not your property. I'm not your solution. I'm not yours." Alessandro's face contorted, shock transforming into the rage she knew so well. He'd never been able to tolerate defiance, could never accept that she might have a will separate from his needs. He spotted a larger knife on the counter beside him, a cleaver, heavy and brutal, and his bloodied hand closed around it. "Then you're no good to me at all." He came at her with the cleaver raised, and Lucia knew with crystal certainty that he meant to kill her, that somewhere in his broken, addiction-corroded mind, he'd decided a dead daughter was better than one who refused to save him. She raised her knife, knowing it wouldn't be enough, knowing she'd bought herself seconds at most. The kitchen door exploded inward. Massimo entered like an avenging angel, covered in blood that wasn't his weapon raised. But he didn't fire. Instead, he crossed the distance between them in 2 strides, caught Alessandro's wrist mid-swing with one hand, and twisted. The sound of breaking bone was distinct and final. Alessandro's scream turned into a sob as the cleaver clattered to the floor. Massimo wrenched his arm behind his back with an efficiency that spoke of 1,000 similar movements, forcing him to his knees on the smoke-stained tile. Blood dripped from a cut above Massimo's eye, and his expensive suit was torn and scorched. But his hands were steady as he kept Alessandro pinned. "Lucia." His voice was rough, damaged by smoke, but his eyes were clear and focused entirely on her. "Are you hurt?" She looked down at herself, at the knife still gripped in her white-knuckled hand, at the blood on her father's arm that she'd put there. "No, I'm not hurt." Alessandro was crying now, great heaving sobs that shook his whole body. Please, I'm her father. You can't, I didn't mean, she's all I have left. You have nothing." Massimo's voice carried the absolute zero of deep space. "You forfeited every right to her the moment you put a price on her head." He looked up at Lucia, and in his eyes she saw a question. Not what to do with Alessandro. That decision had been made the moment Massimo had answered her phone call, but whether she was ready to watch it happen. Whether she could live with the man her father would stop being. Lucia thought of the hospital window, the crowbar, the contract signed in her name without her consent. 23 years of being afraid in her own home. She thought of the girl she'd been that morning, and the woman she'd become in the space of a single night. She met Massimo's eyes and gave a single, small nod. Alessandro saw it. Understood it. "Lucia, no. Baby, please. I'm not your baby." She set the knife down on the counter with a click that sounded like a door closing. "I'm not your daughter. I'm not your anything anymore." She turned her back on him, the most deliberate act of her life, and walked toward Massimo. Behind her, Alessandro's pleas dissolved into incoherent begging. She didn't look back when the begging stopped. Massimo kept Alessandro pinned to the kitchen floor with one knee pressed against his spine, but his attention remained fixed on Lucia. The question in his eyes was clear. This was her decision to make, her ghost to finally put to rest. Around them, the mansion still burned in places, smoke curling through the shattered windows like the last breaths of the old world. Alessandro twisted his head, trying to see her past Massimo's imposing form. His face was a ruin of tears and soot, blood from his slashed arm pooling beneath him on the expensive tile. "Lucia, please. I know I made mistakes. I know I was a bad father, but I can change. I swear to God I can change. Just tell him to let me go. Tell him I'm still your father." The word father hung in the air like a curse. Lucia looked at him, really looked at him for perhaps the first time in years. Without the filter of obligation or the weight of daughterly duty, she saw him clearly. A weak man who had always chosen the easy path, who had medicated his failures with gambling and rage, who had ultimately decided his own survival was worth more than her life. She saw the man who had raised her, yes, but also the man who had tried to sell her to monsters. Her eyes dropped to the cast on her left arm, still white and pristine despite the chaos of the night. Underneath it, bones were slowly knitting back together. Bones he had broken. She touched the bandage on her head, where stitches held together skin he had split. Each injury was a punctuation mark in a sentence she'd been writing her whole life, a sentence that had always ended with her forgiving him. Not anymore. Lucia lifted her gaze to Massimo. In his eyes, she saw no judgment, no pressure, just infinite patience and the promise that whatever she chose, he would make it happen. He would carry the weight of it so she wouldn't have to. This was what protection looked like. Not just the guns and the fortress, but the willingness to become the monster so she could remain human. She looked at Alessandro one final time. At the man who had given her life and then spent 23 years trying to take it back in pieces. "I have no father," she said quietly. The words were simple, final, and absolutely true. She felt something break free inside her chest, not her heart, but the chains that had bound her to a man who'd never deserved the title he claimed. She turned away from Alessandro's renewed sobbing, from his desperate pleas that dissolved into incomprehensible sounds, and walked toward the kitchen door. Behind her, she heard Massimo's voice, low and cold. "You should have loved her better." Then silence. Lucia didn't look back. She walked through the smoke-filled corridors of the burning mansion, past the bodies of mercenaries who'd thought they could breach a fortress, past Massimo's men securing the perimeter, and out into the garden where dawn was just beginning to break over the city. The sky was the color of a healing bruise, purple and pink and gold. She heard Massimo's footsteps behind her moments later, steady and unhurried. When he reached her side, he said nothing. Just stood there in the growing light, a man who had just ended a life and felt no need to explain or justify. His hand found hers, warm and solid, and she held on like it was the only real thing left in the world. "It's over," he said finally. Lucia nodded. It was over. All of it. The fear, the cowering, the girl who'd believed she deserved the violence dealt to her. That girl had died somewhere between the hospital window and this garden. Someone new stood in her place. "What happens now?" she asked. Massimo's thumb traced circles on the back of her hand. A gesture so gentle it seemed impossible from a man who'd just orchestrated a war. "Now we rebuild. The Scarpettas will understand that you're untouchable. The city will know you're under my protection. And you, He turned to face her fully. You decide who you want to become. 3 months later, the restaurant's private dining room gleamed with old-world elegance. Crystal chandeliers, silk wallpaper, and a table that could seat 20, but tonight held only 12. Lucia sat at Massimo's right hand, dressed in a charcoal dress that probably cost more than her old apartment's yearly rent. Her hair swept up to reveal diamond earrings that caught the light with every movement. Her cast was gone. The scar above her eyebrow had faded to a thin white line that she'd decided not to hide. Let them see it. Let them see she was someone who'd survived. Around the table sat Massimo's capos, the men who ran his empire, and their wives, women who'd initially regarded Lucia with skepticism, but had slowly come to accept her presence at the table. She was no longer the waitress who'd poured their coffee. She was the woman who'd stood in a burning kitchen and made the choice that ended a war. She was Massimo's wife. The wedding had been small, private, nothing like the society spectacles his world usually demanded. Just them, a judge, and Marco as witness. The ring on her finger was a simple platinum band that somehow meant more than any diamond. It meant she'd chosen this. Chosen him. Chosen a life where she would never be helpless again. "Salute," Massimo said, raising his wine glass. The table echoed the toast, and Lucia lifted her own glass, meeting her husband's eyes across the rim. In them, she saw the man who'd answered her call on the first ring, who'd brought an army to save her, who'd given her the power to decide her father's fate. But more than that, she saw the man who'd treated her like she was worth saving. Later, when the dinner ended and the guests departed, Massimo led her to the balcony overlooking the rebuilt gardens. The mansion had been restored, stronger than before, with new security measures and reinforced walls. Like her, it had survived its trial by fire and emerged transformed. "Any regrets?" Massimo asked, his arm around her waist. Lucia thought of the girl in the diner, exhausted and afraid, who'd given kindness to a stranger because it was the only thing she had left to give. She thought of the phone call, the shattered window, the knife in her hand. She thought of her father's face in those final moments, and felt nothing but relief that he could never hurt anyone again. "None," she said, and meant it. Some people are born into safety. Others have to fight for it, burn for it, become someone new to claim it. Lucia had learned that real strength wasn't about never being broken. It was about deciding what you'd become when you put yourself back together. She'd chosen to become someone who would never bow again. And in choosing Massimo, she'd found someone who would burn the world to keep her standing. Sometimes the greatest act of self-love is recognizing when someone no longer deserves a place in your life, even if they share your blood. True family isn't defined by genetics, but by who shows up when you're breaking and refuses to let you face it alone. If this story resonated with you, subscribe for more tales of strength, survival, and second chances. Like and share to support stories about women who refuse to stay victims.